everyone, and welcome back to VLGA Connect. It's the weekly governance update, and I'm joined, as always, at this time by Stephen Cooper from the VLGA. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
I'm extra well, thank you. What about you?
I'm well as well. Glad to hear it. And hasn't it been a huge week in governance?
Massive week. I've got a long list of things that we probably won't do justice to any of them, and I just want to thank all those people who've tuned in for last week's episode when we were joined by Richard Scougal from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, our terrific sponsors, to talk about the mandated vaccinations, the impact on local government. It's really struck a chord, Steve. A lot of people are digesting that information with interest, it seems.
And of course, also Richard's rather excellent homework about that Transport New South Wales case, Chris.
Yes, and I must confess, I misunderstood him. I thought that he'd said it had given him a topic to use on a true crime podcast, and I was wondering what true crime podcast is he on? But he was actually referring to this being a true crime podcast. You got that, I think. I didn't.
No, sometimes we just lurch into that space, Chris.
Yeah. You're keeping an eye on Operation What's, the live hearings this week?
I've had it going in the background occasionally, Chris, and to date, nothing to report from local government, but look, always interesting in IBAC live hearing.
Absolutely. It maintains the interest, and of course it's clashing at the moment with the Central Coast Public Inquiry in New South Wales, which is back online, and I confess I've not been able to tune into, but there are reports coming out every day about the evidence that's coming forward in that inquiry as well.
Actually, I've blissfully ignored that one, Chris, so you've given me some homework. Thank you.
Now, and I'm sure there'll be outcomes that we'll talk about at some point. Possibly the big one this week, Steve, from a local government point of view, was the Victorian Ombudsman's report, having looked at the processes around a particular planning issue in the city of Kingston.
Yeah, so that dropped midweek, and the Ombudsman's report was tabled in Parliament. Chris, you might recall for listeners that in episode 169 of VLGA Connect, we actually unpacked the internal report that was undertaken by Kingston into planning permits, and there was some concern expressed. What had caused that report was, I think, from the council's point of view, a need to have some satisfaction that the developers involved in the Casey IBAC hearing, that there were no similar activities that had gone on at Kingston. There's also another report that the council had previously commissioned, a governance report as well. So the council had already commissioned its own work. The Ombudsman report related to a quite specific development at Patterson Lakes, where there had been, I think, a rezoning some 20 years ago. And I think overall the concern from the residents was that what was built was in fact not what was promised 20 years ago when the zoning was done.
Good memory. Episode 169, 14th of May, we commended the council on having conducted that process and being in front of it. And I think it's fair to say the Ombudsman's findings are not out of step with what the council itself has been working on.
I think there's a couple of things there, Chris. And while I think of it, Phil Delosa, the rather excellent governance manager at Kingston, has indicated to me that he's available if anyone wants to follow up with the council more specifically on these matters. And I think the other thing that should be said for the council too, Chris, is interesting that the Ombudsman didn't make any recommendations in that report, which would indicate that the Ombudsman's office is quite satisfied with the findings of the council reports and, you know, the progress that the council had actually undertaken, which is not to say there weren't some issues that were, you know, worthy of a bit of review.
So in summary, the observations were around process, recording of meetings that are held between council people, council laws and officers and developers. Those were some, and the strategic planning process behind that.
I think so, Chris. And look, let's be very clear. So there was no finding of any corruption or wrongdoing either by the senior planning officer or by the two councillors who were named in the report. But the Ombudsman's office and the report did find some deficiencies. And you're very right in terms of the nature of those deficiencies. Look, my reading of it, Chris, is it's one of those issues that can occur when you've got a really complex matter and not everyone in the organisation is across the complexity of that matter. So in a sense, you had ownership of, the decision-making in relation to that particular precinct with an individual, and potentially without the benefit of that kind of peer and council review that might create some healthy tension in the organisation. There was also a perception that the relationship of the senior officer with the developer might be, the allegation was that it was improper. That wasn't found, but I think the Ombudsman made some comments that said it wasn't unreasonable that perception be drawn, given the nature of some of the meetings between the council staff and the developer, and those symptoms that you talked about regarding maybe the inadequacy of documentation of decisions and so on.
So the report is there for all to read. It's been tabled in Parliament. Kingston was pretty quick to come out in response to the report and point out that it was well aware of those issues and working towards them. I did like what the interim CEO had to say about hoping the community can have faith and trust that the council's not going to repeat past mistakes.
Well, it was interesting. It went away from that typical binary narrative, Chris, because the council has said, look, we could be better, but there's no evidence of wrongdoing and corruption. And, often the world's like that.
Okay, hopefully we can put that one to bed. Another one that's not quite put to bed, but the parliamentary inquiry report has come back into, I hate this, but it's what it's become known as, Sluggate. The Sluggate inquiry, as The Age has reported it this morning, into the closure of iCook. It's come back with some recommendations, but it's actually said it found no evidence that government officials had done anything deliberate in terms of omission of evidence, Steve.
No, and I think and I've got to say, Chris, you're probably more across this than me, but my understanding was the report made some critical comments regarding process and decision making, but certainly didn't find anything to do that there was deliberate omission. I guess I'm a little bit torn on this one, Chris, because I'm mindful there is still a legal matter to play out. I suspect it won't be the last time that you and I talk about it, and I'm actually with you. I think the issues, I don't know, is it a mixed metaphor to say the slug's a red herring?
It's a mixed something. You did say back when we first started talking about this, look beyond the slug.
There are some really interesting issues, Chris. And look, I just think process is everything. And let's let the court process play out, because there will be some interesting findings about that. And I'm really looking forward to it. I may editorialise at the end of this.
We might just leave that one there. Just to note that there were 5 recommendations from the inquiry. Things like body cameras to be worn during food safety inspections, which would clear up a lot of the issues in this particular case, and the department ensuring that food is always tested in listeria investigations, and a few other recommendations as well. Another one, so the Parliament is having an impact this week in terms of local government. There's been a private members' bill introduced by the opposition to David Davis, I think in particular from the opposition, to stop, this is particularly due to Yarra's decision to impose fees on businesses using car parks for outdoor dining. I think I've got that right. They've moved to try and block council's ability to impose those sorts of fees. The state government has said they're not going to support that bill, so it's unlikely that it's going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I sort of get a bit torn on. No, I'm not even torn, Chris. I'll make a personal observation, I suppose. This issue has received an extraordinary amount of press in the tabloid media. And, of course, as we know in Melbourne, we only have the tabloid media these days. And I find it really interesting, the level of attention that it's got, that a local council in setting the fees is somehow cast as being the only body responsible for, the continuity of the business sector. If we take a step back, I think it's really important to note that councils operate in a rate capping environment, that councils operate under a principles-based act where at the end of 4 years, councillors' futures will be determined in an election. Of course, we're in an environment where there has been a significant cost shift to local government, and remembering that the source of local government funds, typically for most councils at 65 or 70% of council services, rate capped, come from property rates.
Yeah.
If we look at other levels of government, state government revenues come from stamp duty, payroll tax, land tax. Federal government, you're talking about income taxes, company taxes, GST. So I think it's a useful discussion for people to have around where should funding of particular outcomes come from. So we're in an environment where the federal government decided some months ago to discontinue JobKeeper. Mm-hmm. There have been a series of discussions between federal and state government regarding ongoing business support, but somehow it's the responsibility of a council to, keep local business going. And I think it's, I'd have to say, what I've seen of the response, it seems to be a bit like, what do you say, cracking a walnut by dropping an anvil on it. Yes. There is a quite legitimate discussion, and I'm certainly not defending the Yarra City Council. That's a matter for the Yarra City Council. But there is a quite reasonable discussion about what's the public loss of utility at a time where business is going to resume by certain businesses taking car parking spaces out of action, when we know that often the business community will tell councils that keeping car parks in place is necessary for the continuity of their business. So those are the kind of tensions that councils will deal with. So I'm not sort of saying, councils should be beyond criticism on this point, but can we actually keep this in context? Because if businesses rise and fall, it's not really typically the actions of just one council.
You're being rational and logical again, Stephen Cooper. I'm happy to accuse you of that. I do want to just read you the quotes from Tim Pallas, the Treasurer, who was quoted in the Herald Sun as saying he doesn't like the charges and that the government has written to the council urging them to reverse the decision and that that's the appropriate way to deal with the issue. But he said, local governments have their own constituencies, they're elected by their constituencies, and they're ultimately accountable to those constituencies. From this government's point of view, the desire to impose taxes of this nature is inappropriate, but it's also inappropriate for government to simply jump in over the top of local government.
It's not the fee. I mean, the fee does seem a little on the high side. But, mate, and I don't know, I haven't read the report. I suspect a whole lot of people opining on the fees haven't read the report. And it really does go to what's the relationship between local government and state government. And maybe we'll talk about the state-local government agreement in 2014 at some stage, Chris, because that's a recurring theme as well.
It is. And the other note is that one of the councillors at Yarra has moved or called for a rescission motion. That's going to be considered at the next meeting, which I think is coming up this week. So there'll be more to report on this issue.
Isn't local democracy a fine thing?
It sure is. Okay, I want to go down into Tassie now. An extraordinary story out of Tasmania, and we have talked about this briefly, and we didn't want to go into too much detail. I think we can probably go into a little bit more detail now.
Chris, are you telling me there's been a report?
There's been a report. There has been a report. So the Tasmanian Auditor General, whose name is Rod Whitehead, has tabled a report this week in Tasmanian Parliament on the recruitment, appointment and performance assessment of council general managers in that state. And he's made some recommendations broadly for the sector about basically bringing those processes in line with contemporary human resources practice. But he's done a particular review of the recruitment process that led to the appointment of the general manager of Huon Valley Council. I might get you to step in now, Steve, and tell me what is wrong with this picture where the person who's been appointed is in a relationship with the person who runs the recruitment agency that actually conducted that process for the council.
Gee, Chris, that's a tough one. I just wonder what any of the unsuccessful applicants might say.
I don't wonder, actually. I'm pretty sure I know what they'd say, but you go on. Let's play this out.
Okay, so the successful applicant is in a relationship with the head of the recruitment agency. Clearly a conflict of interest. Can I make the point, Chris? And it's why I think the views of and the confidence of the unsuccessful applicants in the process is paramount here. And like everyone's going to be disappointed from time to time about a recruitment process. I think it's a conflict of a nature that can't be managed in any way, shape or form. You couldn't have that person step aside and have someone else deal with the matter because the conflict still exists between an owner of that company and the successful applicant. So it would strike me, unless there is some stunning information that I'm not aware of, that relationship is fatally flawed. And the minute the successful applicant was going to be an applicant, the recruiting company needed to step back and say that they couldn't do it, or he needed to not be an applicant. I kind of think that's pretty simple.
Can I read you what the Auditor General said? Because he would know all of the facts of the matter, and and I quote, his finding is that it was inadequate management of the conflict of interest, resulting in a flawed recruitment process. The potential for bias and unfair treatment of applicants was significant throughout the process. The process also undermined the public confidence required in an appointment as significant as the General Manager of Council.
I would say so. And I think my point, Chris, was that sometimes you might seek to manage the conflict by saying, well, we won't get that person to do it, but another person can. And the perception would have still existed.
So the Mayor of that council has publicly said they accept the findings and the recommendations that come out of that. I just wonder, does anything happen now in terms of that appointment and the stability of that appointment?
I can't talk for the stability, Chris, but I think you've got an interesting situation where a contract of employment's been created, and it'd be up for people like our friends at Hunt & Hunt to sort of indicate whether there was something in the process other than the conflict of interest, though, which would sort of point to the contract of employment not being enforceable. Otherwise, you would assume it just rolls on, however tainted.
One would assume that report from the Auditor General is going to be consumed with great interest by all of the parties that were involved in that process. Stephen, we might just leave that there. But in respect of the broader recommendations, Mr. Whitehead said 5 out of 6 councils examined had contracted a consultant to assist with the recruitment process, with instances of both good and poor practice identified. And he's highlighted some instances of poor practice. And made some recommendations, as I said at the outset, how those processes could be more in line with contemporary human resources practices.
Yeah, Chris, you and I talked before about the fact that for councils there is no more important contractual arrangement than the employment contract with the chief executive. So I just wonder if we might not come back to that. Our listener can actually put on that list of things that we're going to come back to unpack what that report might say more broadly about the ongoing management of CEO contracts, because I think it's worth a review.
That listener contacted me during the week to say, ha, smiley face, Kill Bill 2. So I've got a feeling they're a little bit behind and they're catching up. So it might be a while before we get the updated list, Steve.
No, I'm leaving it right there. I'm sure that listener is usually quite current, but anyway.
Now, before we wrap up, you've got a cracker of the story to finish on out of New Zealand. A bit of wizardry and magic going on here. What's the story with the Wizard of Christchurch Council?
This is spellbinding, Chris. And let's just pun. My understanding is, and I didn't know until I read that the Wizard had their own wiki page, that the Christchurch City Council has been on a contractual basis paying for a wizard to be in town doing wizardry, I presume.
That's going to be my question. Doing what?
For the last 16 years. And the bit that made the media was that the council had concluded that contractual arrangement. The wizard is none too impressed and has in fact, I think, threatened to put a curse on the council.
I didn't know there was a Wikipedia page for the Wizard until you pointed it out to me. He's 88.
Yeah, and there's a long history of the Wizard. He's the Wizard of New Zealand, I think. And, yeah, as I said, at some point, I think he was standing on a soapbox and doing wizarding things, wearing something like the sorting hat from the Harry Potter movies. Right. And the council contracted with the Wizard to continue to provide those wizarding services. I did find it quite amusing that the Wizard was at pains to point out that it was a contractual payment, not a salary. I don't know if that's an issue for the tax office. But the council, as I said, has terminated that. And let's be fair to Christchurch Council, they have had a bit going on in that intervening 16 years. So maybe with earthquakes and so on, and maybe the contractual arrangement with the Wizard hadn't been at the top of the kind of decision pile.
I'm sure that's right.
Period.
It's 23 years, actually, Steve. $16,000 a year, which is where you might have got the 16 from.
Yes.
For 23 years. But I love the last line in the story that I've read about this. The termination of the Wizard's contract won't stop his acts of wizardry. He's saying they'd have to kill him first. That's pretty dramatic. On that magical note, thanks for the wizardry as always, Steve. We'll see you again for another VLGA Connect Governance Update next week.
Good trick, Chris. See you.
And our program is brought to you by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers from VLGA Connect. Thanks for joining us. See you again soon.